Häuserbloem ASMR. Hey you, who is't? I was in the mood to do some reading, and I thought, why not do it together? I've got a special book here, and what's it about? Well, in 1831, Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle, embarked on a survey expedition that was expected to last 2 years. But in actuality, the expedition lasted almost 5 years. On board the Beagle was Charles Darwin, who kept a journal and notes covering biology, geology, and anthropology, and describing everything he experienced along his travels. We are reading from his journal, which was first published in 1839. The Voyage of the Beagle, Charles Darwin. Chapter 1, St. Jago to Cape de Verde Islands. After having been twice driven back by heavy southwestern gales, Her Majesty's ship Beagle, a 10-gun brig, under the command of Captain Fitzroy, Royal Ship, sailed from Devonport on the 27th of December 1831. The object of the expedition was to complete the survey of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, commenced under Captain King in 1826 to 1830, to survey the shores of Chile, Peru, and some of the islands in the Pacific, and to carry a chain of chronometrical measurements around the world. On the 6th of January, we reached Tenerife, but were prevented landing by fears of our bringing the cholera. The next morning, we saw the sun rise behind the rugged outline of the Grand Canary Island, and suddenly illumine the peak of Tenerife, whilst the lower parts were veiled in fleecy clouds. This was the first of many delightful days never to be forgotten. The country rises in successive steps of table land, interspersed with some truncate conical hills, and the horizon is bounded by an irregular chain of more lofty mountains. The scene as beheld through the hazy atmosphere of this climate is one of great interest. If indeed a person fresh from sea and who has just walked for the first time in a grove of coconut trees can be a judge of anything but his own happiness. Few living creatures inhabit these valleys. The commonest bird is a kingfisher, which tamely sits on the branches of the castor oil plant, and thence darts on grasshoppers and lizards. Near Fuentes, we saw a large flock of guinea fowl, probably 50 or 60 in number. They were extremely wary and could not be approached. They avoided us like partridges on a rainy day in September, running with their heads cocked up, and if pursued, they readily took to the wing. While looking for marine animals, with my head about 2 feet above the rocky shore, I was more than once saluted by a jet of water, accompanied by a slight grating noise. At first I could not think what it was, but afterwards I found out that it was this cuttlefish which, though concealed in a hole, thus often led me to its discovery. That it possesses the power of ejecting water there is no doubt, and it appeared to me that it could certainly take good aim by directing the tube or siphon on the underside of its body. From the difficulty which these animals have in carrying their heads, they cannot crawl with ease when placed on the ground. I observed that one which I kept in the cabin was slightly phosphorescent in the dark. Chapter 2. Rio de Janeiro. During the remainder of my stay at Rio, I resided in a cottage at Botafogo Bay. It was impossible to wish for anything more delightful than thus to spend some weeks in so magnificent a country. In England, any person fond of natural history enjoys in his walks a great advantage by always having something to attract his attention. But in these fertile climates, teeming with life, the attractions are so numerous that he is scarcely able to walk at all. After the hotter days, it was delicious to sit quietly in the garden and watch the evening pass into night. Nature in these climes chooses her vocalists from more humble performers than in Europe. A small frog of the genus Hyla sits on a blade of grass about an inch above the surface of the water and sends forth a pleasing chirp. When several are together, they sing in harmony on different notes. I had some difficulty in catching a specimen of this frog. The genus Hyla has its toes terminated by small suckers, and I found this animal could crawl up a pane of glass when placed absolutely perpendicular. Various cicadae and crickets at the same time keep up a ceaseless shrill cry, but which, softened by the distance, is not unpleasant. Every evening after dark this great concert commenced, and often have I sat listening to it until my attention has been drawn away by some curious passing insect. Chapter 3. Maldonado. At night we came to the house of Don Juan Fuentes, a rich landed proprietor, but not personally known to either of my companions. On approaching the house of a stranger, it is usual to follow several little points of etiquette. Riding up slowly to the door, the salutation of Ave Maria is given, and until somebody comes out and asks you to alight, it is not customary even to get off your horse. The formal answer of the owner is sin pecado concebida, that is, conceived without sin. Having entered the house, some general conversation is kept up for a few minutes, till permission is asked to pass the night there. This is granted as a matter of course. The stranger then takes his meals with the family, and a room is assigned him, where, with the horse cloths belonging to his recado, he makes his bed. It is curious how similar circumstances produce such similar results in manners. At the Cape of Good Hope, the same hospitality and very nearly the same points of etiquette are universally observed. The difference, however, between the character of the Spaniard and that of the Dutch Boer is shown by the former never asking his guest a single question beyond the strictest rule of politeness, whilst the honest Dutchman demands where he has been, where he is going, what is his business, and even how many brothers, sisters, or children he may happen to have. After witnessing the rude wealth displayed in the number of cattle, men, and horses, Don Juan's miserable house was quite curious. The floor consisted of hardened mud, and the windows were without glass. The sitting room boasted only of a few of the roughest chairs and stools, with a couple of tables. The supper, although several strangers were present, consisted of two huge piles, one of roast beef, the other of boiled, with some pieces of pumpkin. Besides this latter, there was no other vegetable, and not even a morsel of bread. For drinking, a large earthenware jug of water served the whole party. Yet this man was the owner of several square miles of land, of which nearly every acre would produce corn, and, with a little trouble, all the common vegetables. The evening was spent in smoking, with a little impromptu singing, accompanied by the guitar. The señoritas all sat together in one corner of the room, and did not sup with the men. Chapter 4. Rio Negro to Bahiablanca, August 11th, 1833. Mr. Harris, an Englishman residing at Patagonia, a guide, and 5 gauchos who were proceeding to the army on business, were my companions on the journey. The Colorado, as I have already said, is nearly 80 miles distant, and as we travelled slowly, we were 2 days and a half on the road. The whole line of country deserves scarcely a better name than that of a desert. Water is found only in 2 small wells. It is called fresh, but even at this time of the year, during the rainy season, it was quite brackish. In the summer this must be a distressing passage, for now it was sufficiently desolate. The valley of the Rio Negro, broad as it is, has merely been excavated out of the sandstone plain, for immediately above the bank on which the town stands, a level country commences, which is interrupted only by a few trifling valleys and depressions. Everywhere the landscape wears the same sterile aspect. A dry, gravelly soil supports tufts of brown, withered grass, and low scattered bushes armed with thorns. Shortly after passing the first spring, we came in sight of a famous tree, which the Indians reverence as the altar of Walichu. It is situated on a high part of the plain, and hence is a landmark visible at a great distance. As soon as a tribe of Indians come in sight of it, they offer their adorations by loud shouts. The tree itself is low, much branched and thorny. Just above the root it has a diameter of about 3 feet. It stands by itself without any neighbour, and was indeed the first tree we saw. Afterwards we met with a few others of the same kind, but they were far from common. Being winter, the tree had no leaves, but in their place numberless threads, by which the various offerings, such as cigars, bread, meat, pieces of cloth, etc., had been suspended. Poor Indians, not having anything better, only pull a thread out of their ponchos and fasten it to the tree. Richer Indians are accustomed to pour spirits and mate into a certain hole, and likewise to smoke upwards, thinking thus to afford all possible gratification to Walichu. To complete the scene, the tree was surrounded by the bleached bones of horses which had been slaughtered as sacrifices. All Indians of every age and sex make their offerings. They then think that their horses will not tire, and that they themselves shall be prosperous. The gaucho who told me this said that in the time of peace he had witnessed this scene, and that he and others used to wait till the Indians had passed by for the sake of stealing from Walichu the offerings. The gauchos think that the Indians consider the tree as the god itself, but it seems far more probable that they regard it as the altar. We passed the night in Punta Alta, and I employed myself in searching for fossil bones, this point being a perfect catacomb for monsters of extinct races. The evening was perfectly calm and clear. The extreme monotony of the view gave it an interest even in the midst of mudbanks and gulls, sand hillocks and solitary vultures. In riding back in the morning, we came across a very fresh track of a puma, but did not succeed in finding it. Chapter 5. Bahiablanca. On one fine hot day, I saw several ostriches enter a bed of tall rushes, where they squatted, concealed, till quite closely approached. It is not generally known that ostriches readily take to the water. Mr. King informs me that at the Bay of San Blas and at Port Valdez in Patagonia, he saw these birds swimming several times from island to island. They ran into the water both when driven down to a point and likewise of their own accord when not frightened. The distance crossed was about 200 yards. When swimming, very little of their bodies appear above water. Their necks are extended a little forward, and their progress is slow. On 2 occasions I saw some ostriches swimming across the Santa Cruz River, where its course was about 400 yards wide and the stream rapid. I heard also some account of an engagement which took place a few weeks previously to the one mentioned at Cholchel. This is a very important station on account of being a pass for horses, and it was in consequence for some time the headquarters of a division of the army. When the troops first arrived there, they found a tribe of Indians, of whom they killed 20 or 30. The cacique escaped in a manner which astonished everyone. The chief Indians always have 1 or 2 picked horses, which they keep ready for any urgent occasion. On one of these, an old white horse, the cacique sprung, taking with him his little son. The horse had neither saddle nor bridle. To avoid the shots, the Indian rode in the peculiar method of his nation, namely, with an arm round the horse's neck and one leg only on its back. Thus hanging on one side, he was seen patting the horse's head and talking to him. The pursuers urged every effort in the chase. The commandant 3 times changed his horse, but all in vain. The old Indian father and his son escaped and were free. Chapter 6. Bahiablanca to Buenos Aires. September 8th. I hired a gaucho to accompany me on my ride to Buenos Aires, though with some difficulty, as the father of one man was afraid to let him go, and another, who seemed willing, was described to me as so fearful that I was afraid to take him, for I was told that even if he saw an ostrich at a distance, he would mistake it for an Indian, and would fly like the wind away. As it was early in the afternoon when we arrived, we took fresh horses and a soldier for a guide, and started for the Sierra de la Ventana. This mountain is visible from the anchorage at Bahiablanca, and Captain Fitzroy calculates its height to be 3,340 feet, an altitude very remarkable on this eastern side of the continent. I do not think nature ever made a more solitary, desolate pile of rock. In the morning, the guide told me to ascend the nearest ridge, which he thought would lead me to the 4 peaks that crown the summit. The climbing up such rough rocks was very fatiguing. The sides were so indented that what was gained in 5 minutes was often lost in the next. At last, when I reached the ridge, my disappointment was extreme in finding a precipitous valley as deep as the plain, which cut the chain transversely in 2 and separated me from the 4 points. Having descended, and while crossing it, I saw 2 horses grazing. I immediately hid myself in the long grass and began to reconnoitre, but as I could see no signs of Indians, I proceeded cautiously on my second ascent. It was late in the day, and this part of the mountain, like the other, was steep and rugged. I was on the top of the second peak by 2 o'clock, but got there with extreme difficulty. Every 20 yards I had the cramp in the upper part of both thighs, so that I was afraid I should not have been able to have got down again. It was also necessary to return by another road, as it was out of the question to pass over the saddleback. I was therefore obliged to give up the 2 higher peaks. Their altitude was but little greater, and every purpose of geology had been answered, so that the attempt was not worth the hazard of any further exertion. I presume the cause of the cramp was the great change in the kind of muscular action from that of hard riding to that of still harder climbing. It is a lesson worth remembering, as in some cases it might cause much difficulty. I was, on the whole, disappointed with this ascent. Even the view was insignificant. A plain like the sea, but without its beautiful colour and defined outline. The scene, however, was novel, and a little danger like salty meat gave it a relish. That danger was very little was certain, for my 2 companions made a good fire, a thing which is never done when it is suspected that Indians are near. I reached the place of our bivouac by sunset, and drinking much mate and smoking several cigaritos, soon made up my bed for the night. The wind was very strong and cold, but I never slept more comfortably. The city of Buenos Aires is large, and I should think one of the most regular in the world. Every street is at right angles to the one it crosses, and the parallel ones being equidistant, the houses are collected into solid squares of equal dimensions, which are called quadras. On the other hand, the houses themselves are hollow squares, all the rooms opening into a neat little courtyard. They are generally only 1 story high with flat roofs, which are fitted with seats, and are much frequented by the inhabitants in summer. Chapter 7. Buenos Aires and Santa Fe. In the evening we crossed the Rio Arrecife on a simple raft made of barrels lashed together, and slept at the post house on the other side. I this day paid horse hire for 31 leagues, and although the sun was glaring hot, I was but little fatigued. When Captain Head talks of riding 50 leagues a day, I do not imagine the distance is equal to 150 English miles. At all events, the 31 leagues was only 76 miles in a straight line, and in an open country I should think 4 additional miles for turnings would be a sufficient allowance. October 3rd and 4th. I was confined for these 2 days to my bed by a headache. A good-natured old woman who attended me wished me to try many odd remedies. A common practice is to bind an orange leaf or a bit of black plaster to each temple, and a still more general plan is to split a bean into halves, moisten them, and place one on each temple, where they will easily adhere. It is not thought proper ever to remove the beans or plaster, but to allow them to drop off. And sometimes, if a man with patches on his head is asked, "What is the matter?" he will answer, "I had a headache the day before yesterday." One day, when hunting on the banks of the Uruguay, I was shown certain trees, to which jaguars constantly recur, for the purpose, as it is said, of sharpening their claws. I saw 3 well-known trees. In front, the bark was worn smooth, as if by the breast of the animal, and on each side there were deep scratches, or rather grooves, extending in an oblique line, nearly a yard in length. The scars were of different ages. A common method of ascertaining whether a jaguar is in the neighborhood is to examine these trees. I imagine this habit of the jaguar is exactly similar to one which may any day be seen in the common cat, as with outstretched legs and exerted claws it scrapes the leg of the chair, and I have heard of young fruit trees in an orchard in England having been thus much injured. Some such habit must also be common to the puma, for on the bare hard soil of Patagonia I have frequently seen scores so deep that no other animal could have made them. Chapter 8. Banda Oriental and Patagonia. December 6th. The Beagle sailed from the Rio Plata, never again to enter its muddy stream. Our course was directed to Port Desire, on the coast of Patagonia. Before proceeding any farther, I will here put together a few observations made at sea. Several times, when the ship has been some miles off the mouth of the Plata, and at other times, when off the shores of northern Patagonia, we've been surrounded by insects. One evening, when we were about 10 miles from the Bay of San Blas, vast numbers of butterflies, in bands or flocks of countless myriads, extended as far as the eye could range. Even by the aid of a telescope, it was not possible to see a space free from butterflies. The seamen cried out, "It was snowing butterflies," and such, in fact, was the appearance. The first landing in any new country is very interesting, and especially when, as in this case, the whole aspect bears the stamp of a marked and individual character. At the height of between 200 and 300 feet above some masses of porphyry, a white plain extends, which is truly characteristic of Patagonia. The weather is dry and pleasant, and the fine blue sky is but seldom obscured. When standing in the middle of one of these desert plains and looking towards the interior, the view is generally bounded by the escarpment of another plain, rather higher but equally level and desolate, and in every other direction the horizon is indistinct from the trembling mirage which seems to rise from the heated surface. The guanaco, or wild llama, is the characteristic quadruped of the plains of Patagonia. It is the South American representative of the camel of the East. It is an elegant animal in a state of nature, with a long slender neck and fine legs. It is very common over the whole of the temperate parts of the continent, as far south as the islands near Cape Horn. It generally lives in small herds of from half a dozen to 30 in each, but on the banks of the Santa Cruz we saw one herd which must have contained at least 500. That they are curious is certain, for if a person lies on the ground and plays strange antics, such as throwing up his feet in the air, they will almost always approach by degrees to reconnoitre him. I have more than once seen a guanaco, on being approached, not only neigh and squeal, but prance and leap about in the most ridiculous manner, apparently in defiance as a challenge. These animals are very easily domesticated, and I have seen some thus kept in northern Patagonia near a house, though not under any restraint. They are in this state very bold, and readily attack a man by striking him from behind with both knees. It is asserted that the motive for these attacks is jealousy on account of their females. Chapter 9. Santa Cruz, Patagonia, and the Falkland Islands. April 27th. This day I shot a condor. It measured from tip to tip of the wings 8.5 feet, and from beak to tail 4 feet. With respect to their propagation, I was told by the country people in Chile that the condor makes no sort of nest, but in the months of November and December lays 2 large white eggs on a shelf of bare rock. It is said that the young condors cannot fly for an entire year, and long after they are able, they continue to roost by night and hunt by day with their parents. When the condors are wheeling in a flock round and round any spot, their flight is beautiful. Except when rising from the ground, I do not recollect ever having seen one of these birds flap its wings. Near Lima, I watched several for nearly half an hour without once taking off my eyes. They moved in large curves, sweeping in circles, descending and ascending without giving a single flap. As they glided close over my head, I intently watched from an oblique position the outlines of the separate and great terminal feathers of each wing. And these separate feathers, if there had been the least vibratory movement, would have appeared as if blended together. But they were seen distinct against the blue sky. The head and neck were moved frequently, and apparently with force, and the extended wings seemed to form the fulcrum on which the movements of the neck, body and tail acted. If the bird wished to descend, the wings were for a moment collapsed, and when again expanded with an altered inclination, the momentum gained by the rapid descent seemed to urge the bird upward with the even and steady movement of a paper kite. It rained during nearly the whole day. At night we managed, however, with our saddle cloths, to keep ourselves pretty well dry and warm. But the ground on which we slept was on one occasion nearly in the state of a bog, and there was not a dry spot to sit down on after our day's ride. I have in another part stated how singular it is that there should be absolutely no trees on these islands, although Tierra del Fuego is covered by one large forest. It was very surprising to see the gauchos in the midst of rain and everything soaking wet, with nothing more than a tinder box and a piece of rag, immediately make a fire. They sought beneath the tufts of grass and bushes for a few dry twigs, and these they rubbed into fibres. Then, surrounding them with coarser twigs, something like a bird's nest, they put the rag with its spark of fire in the middle and covered it up. The nest being then held up to the wind, by degrees it smoked more and at last burst out in flames. I do not think any other method would have had a chance of succeeding with such damp materials. Chapter 10. Tierra del Fuego. In the morning, the captain sent a party to communicate with the Fuegians. When we came within hail, one of the 4 natives who were present advanced to receive us and began to shout most vehemently, wishing to direct us where to land. When we were on shore, the party looked rather alarmed, but continued talking and making gestures with great rapidity. It was without exception the most curious and interesting spectacle I ever beheld. The chief spokesman was old and appeared to be the head of the family. The 3 others were powerful young men, about 6 feet high. The women and children had been sent away. The old man had a fillet of white feathers tied round his head, which partly confined his black, coarse and entangled hair. His face was crossed by 2 broad, transverse bars. One, painted bright red, reached from ear to ear and included the upper lip. The other, white like chalk, extended above and parallel to the first, so that even his eyelids were thus coloured. After we had presented them with some scarlet cloth, which they immediately tied round their necks, they became good friends. This was shown by the old man patting our breasts and making a chuckling kind of noise, as people do when feeding chickens. I walked with the old man, and this demonstration of friendship was repeated several times. It was concluded by 3 hard slaps, which were given me on the breast and back at the same time. He then bared his bosom for me to return the compliment, which being done, he seemed highly pleased. The language of these people, according to our notions, scarcely deserves to be called articulate. Captain Cook has compared it to a man clearing his throat, but certainly no European ever cleared his throat with so many hoarse, guttural and clicking sounds. The Fuegian wigwam resembles in size and dimensions a haycock. It merely consists of a few broken branches stuck in the ground, and very imperfectly thatched on one side with a few tufts of grass and rushes. The whole cannot be the work of an hour, and it is only used for a few days. At Gowrie Roads I saw a place where one of these naked men had slept, which absolutely offered no more cover than the form of a hare. The man was evidently living by himself, and York Minster said he was very bad man, and that probably he had stolen something. Captain Fitzroy could never ascertain that the Fuegians have any distinct belief in a future life. They sometimes bury their dead in caves, and sometimes in the mountain forests. We do not know what ceremonies they perform. The different tribes have no government or chief, yet each is surrounded by other hostile tribes, speaking different dialects and separated from each other only by a deserted border or neutral territory. The cause of their warfare appears to be the means of subsistence. Their country is a broken mass of wild rocks, lofty hills, and useless forests, and these are viewed through mists and endless storms. The habitable land is reduced to the stones on the beach. In search of food, they are compelled unceasingly to wander from spot to spot, and so steep is the coast that they can only move about in their wretched canoes. Chapter 11. Strait of Magellan. Before reaching Port Famine, 2 men were seen running along the shore and hailing the ship. A boat was sent for them. They turned out to be 2 sailors who'd run away from a sealing vessel and had joined the Patagonians. These Indians had treated them with their usual disinterested hospitality. They had parted company through accident and were then proceeding to Port Famine in hopes of finding some ship. I dare say they were worthless vagabonds, but I never saw more miserable-looking ones. They'd been living for some days on mussel shells and berries, and their tattered clothes had been burnt by sleeping so near their fires. They'd been exposed day and night, without any shelter, to the late incessant gales, with rain, sleet, and snow, and yet they were in good health. When the Beagle was here in the month of February, I started one morning at 4 o'clock to ascend Mount Tarn, which is 2,600 feet high, and is the most elevated point in this immediate district. The forest commences at the line of high water mark, and during the first 2 hours I gave over all hopes of reaching the summit. So thick was the wood that it was necessary to have constant recourse to the compass, for every landmark, though in a mountainous country, was completely shut out. In the deep ravines the death-like scene of desolation exceeded all description. Outside it was blowing a gale, but in these hollows not even a breath of wind stirred the leaves of the tallest trees. So gloomy, cold, and wet was every part that not even the fungi, mosses, or ferns could flourish. Chapter 12. Central Chile. July 23rd. The Beagle anchored late at night in the bay of Valparaiso, the chief seaport of Chile. When morning came, everything appeared delightful. After Tierra del Fuego, the climate felt quite delicious. The atmosphere so dry and the heavens so clear and blue with the sun shining brightly that all nature seemed sparkling with life. I had the good fortune to find living here Mr. Richard Caulfield, an old schoolfellow and friend, to whose hospitality and kindness I was greatly indebted, in having afforded me a most pleasant residence during the Beagle stay in Chile. The immediate neighborhood of Valparaiso is not very productive to the naturalist. During the long summer, the wind blows steadily from the southward and a little offshore, so that rain never falls. During the 3 winter months, however, it is sufficiently abundant. I took several long walks while collecting objects of natural history. The country is pleasant for exercise. There are many very beautiful flowers, and, as in most other dry climates, the plants and shrubs possess strong and peculiar odors. Even one's clothes, by brushing through them, became scented. The setting of the sun was glorious, the valleys being black, whilst the snowy peaks of the Andes yet retained a ruby tint. When it was dark, we made a fire beneath a little arbor of bamboos, fried our charqui, or dried slips of beef, took our mate, and were quite comfortable. There is an inexpressible charm in thus living in the open air. The evening was calm and still. The shrill noise of the mountain biscacha and the faint cry of a goat-sucker were occasionally to be heard. Besides these, few birds or even insects frequent these dry, parched mountains. The appearance of the Andes was different from that which I had expected. The lower line of the snow was of course horizontal, and to this line the even summits of the range seemed quite parallel. Only at long intervals a group of points or a single cone showed where a volcano had existed or does now exist. Chapter 13. Chiloe and Jonas Islands. The inhabitants, from their complexion and low stature, appear to have 3/4 of Indian blood in their veins. They are a humble, quiet, industrious set of men. Although the fertile soil, resulting from the decomposition of the volcanic rocks, supports a rank vegetation, yet the climate is not favorable to any production which requires much sunshine to ripen it. The staple articles of food are pigs, potatoes, and fish. The people all dress in strong woolen garments, which each family makes for itself, and dyes with indigo of a dark blue color. The day rose splendidly clear. The volcano of Orsono was spouting out volumes of smoke. This most beautiful mountain, formed like a perfect cone and white with snow, stands out in front of the Cordillera. Another great volcano, with a saddle-shaped summit, also emitted from its immense crater little jets of steam. Subsequently, we saw the lofty-peaked Corcovado, well deserving the name of El Famoso Corcovado. Thus we beheld, from one point of view, 3 great active volcanoes, each about 7,000 feet high. At night we reached the island of Quinchao. This neighborhood is the most cultivated part of the archipelago. For a broad strip of land on the coast of the main island, as well as on many of the smaller adjoining ones, is almost completely cleared. Some of the farmhouses seemed very comfortable. I was curious to ascertain how rich any of these people might be, but Mr. Douglas says that no one can be considered as possessing a regular income. One of the richest landowners might possibly accumulate in a long industrious life as much as £1,000 sterling. But should this happen, it would all be stowed away in some secret corner, for it is the custom of almost every family to have a jar or treasure chest buried in the ground. The arrival of our boats was a rare event in this quiet, retired corner of the world, and nearly all the inhabitants came down to the beach to see us pitch our tents. They were very civil and offered us a house, and one man even sent us a cask of cider as a present. In the afternoon we paid our respects to the governor, a quiet old man who, in his appearance and manner of life, was scarcely superior to an English cottager. At night heavy rain set in, which was hardly sufficient to drive away from our tents the large circle of lookers-on. An Indian family, who had come to trade in a canoe from Ceylon, bivouacked near us. They had no shelter during the rain. In the morning I asked a young Indian, who was wet to the skin, how he had passed the night. He seemed perfectly content and answered, "Muy bien, señor." The wild potato grows on these islands in great abundance, on the sandy, shelly soil near the sea beach. The tallest plant was 4 feet in height. The tubers were generally small, but I found one of an oval shape, 2 inches in diameter. They resembled in every respect and had the same smell as English potatoes, but when boiled they shrunk much and were watery and insipid, without any bitter taste. Chapter 14. Chile and Concepcion. Great earthquake. On January 15th, 1835, we sailed from Low's Harbour and 3 days afterwards anchored a second time in the Bay of San Carlos in Chiloé. On the night of the 19th, the volcano of Osorno was in action. I was surprised at hearing afterwards that Aconcagua in Chile, 480 miles northwards, was in action on the same night, and still more surprised to hear that the great eruption of Concepcion, 2,700 miles north of Aconcagua, accompanied by an earthquake felt over 1,000 miles, also occurred within 6 hours of this same time. This coincidence is the most remarkable, as Concepcion had been dormant for 26 years, and Aconcagua most rarely shows any signs of action. It is difficult even to conjecture whether this coincidence was accidental or shows some subterranean connection. During the summer, many of the Indians wander about the forests, but chiefly in the higher parts, where the woods are not quite so thick, in search of the half-wild cattle which live on the leaves of the cane and certain trees. It was one of these huntsmen who by chance discovered, a few years since, an English vessel which had been wrecked on the outer coast. The crew were beginning to fail in provisions, and it is not probable that, without the aid of this man, they would ever have extricated themselves from these scarcely penetrable woods. The day was beautiful, and the number of trees which were in full flower perfumed the air. Yet even this could hardly dissipate the effects of the gloomy dampness of the forest. Moreover, the many dead trunks that stand like skeletons never failed to give to these primeval woods a character of solemnity, absent in those of countries long civilized. Shortly after sunset, we bivouacked for the night. The district of Cusao is the only inhabited part on the whole west coast of Chiloé. It contains about 30 or 40 Indian families, who are scattered along 4 or 5 miles off the shore. They are very much secluded from the rest of Chiloé, and have scarcely any sort of commerce, except sometimes in a little oil, which they get from seal blubber. I have not attempted to give any detailed description of the appearance of Concepcion, for I feel that it is quite impossible to convey the mingled feelings which I experienced. Several of the officers visited it before me, but their strongest language failed to give a just idea of the scene of desolation. It is a bitter and humiliating thing to see works which have cost man so much time and labor overthrown in 1 minute. Yet compassion for the inhabitants was almost instantly banished by the surprise in seeing a state of things produced in a moment of time which one was accustomed to attribute to a succession of ages. In my opinion, we have scarcely beheld, since leaving England, any sight so deeply interesting. Thanks a bunch for listening, and all that's left to say now is salut, de kost en de wind van achter. Bye.